March 9, 1945. Tokyo slept under the clear skies of late winter. On the surface, everything seemed calm. The muffled sound of bicycles, the steam coming out of the public baths, the aroma of rice and fish in the family's dinners. The air raid alerts had become background noise. No one ran to the shelters anymore. After all, the American bombings came too high, too inaccurate, too rare. The Japanese command knew this, and so he believed that the capital was, if not protected, at least prepared. That confidence was about to fade at the speed of a white phosphorus ignition. What happened that night was not just a bombing. It was the extreme application of a doctrine to transform the American war industry into an instrument of total annulment, not against military targets, but against the domestic productive base, the civilian workers, the paper and wood homes. Japan would see in a few hours what it means to fight a power that no longer bombarded with anger, but with algorithms, logistics, and mathematical precision. This is the story of when Japan's most important city became a laboratory test, and he lost. But before we dive into the data, there is a statistic that defines this story with brutal clarity. In less than 3 hours, 1,765 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on a city made of paper and wood. The result: more than 100,000 dead, 267,000 buildings destroyed, and 15 square miles burned, an area larger than the entire center of Manhattan. It was the deadliest airstrike in history, more than any atomic bomb. But what reduced Tokyo to ashes was not napalm. It was the ability to calculate, test, repeat, an operation created by engineers, powered by factories, and perfected by scientists. And if you value this kind of analysis, where facts meet history and irony reveals more than 1,000 words, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is the fuel that keeps that memory alive. In 1942, when the Germans laughed at America's supposed dependence on machines and statistics, a new project took shape in Boeing's hangars, the B-29 Superfortress, a bomber that was not born of urgency, but of vision. The United States War Department invested $3 billion in the development of the aircraft, an amount that exceeded the total cost of the Manhattan Project, responsible for creating the atomic bombs. It was more than a weapon. It was a technological manifesto. The B-29 was the first pressurized bomber in history, capable of flying at altitudes that many planes could not even reach. Powered by Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines of 2,200 horsepower each, its fuselage housed an automated defense system with 50 machine gun turrets operated remotely by computer sight. Its range exceeded 5,000 kilometers. Its payload exceeded 9 tons. But the scariest thing wasn't the airplane, it was the ability to produce it. While Germany was still dividing its efforts between Messerschmitts, Junkers, and emergency adaptations, the United States had already decentralized B-29 production among 5 states and 4 manufacturers. In Wichita, Kansas, Boeing's factory alone delivered a Superfortress every 63 minutes. The data doesn't lie. American production of heavy bombers was 10 times higher than German production in the same period. If this number surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins." Because that's exactly what happened. Germany, still clinging to artisanal engineering and an obsession with individual fighters, never understood what was coming. An enemy that produced faster than its own soldiers could react. The Axis Air Force fought with excellent machines, but in insufficient quantities. The United States had already mastered the concept of saturation warfare, not just destroying the enemy, but preventing him from breathing. The B-29 was expensive, complex, required extensive training and advanced infrastructure. But when the entire system had already been built to operate at this level, cost was no longer an obstacle. It was part of the plan. In all, 3,170 units were delivered by the end of the war, a number unthinkable for any other nation in that scenario. Each plane was a flying fortress, But above all, it was the result of a national gear. Engineering came from universities, the napalm of the chemical industries, the carcass of assembly lines, and the pilots. They came out of intensive training programs that already trained hundreds of new aviators per month. The comparison with the Japanese reality is cruel. By 1945, Japan could barely keep its planes in the air. Shortages of aluminum, fuel, and spare parts had paralyzed some combat aviation. Japanese night fighters were makeshift adaptations of aircraft designed for other roles. And even the best, such as the Ki-45 Toryu, could not operate effectively at altitudes higher than 9,000 meters. The B-29 flew at more than 10,000. With speed, payload, range, and endurance unattainable by Axis standards, the superfortress became unattainable not only in the skies, but in concept. It was not just a product of the industry, it was a symbol of the paradigm shift. War no longer belonged to the generals, it belonged to the engineers. And it was exactly this reasoning that would redesign the way Tokyo was bombed. But before the targets were marked, there was a decision to be made, because even the world's largest flying fortress could still be made more lethal if Americans were willing to give up defense and bet everything on destruction. And that decision was already in the hands of a man who did not believe in accurate bombing. In 1945, the skies over Tokyo belonged, in fact, to the United States. Not by chance, but by calculation and omission. The Japanese defensive structure, when examined with the coolness of a technical report, exhibits more holes than armor. Imperial Japan operated two independent air forces, one controlled by the army, the other by the navy, and silence reigned among them. There was no joint command, no unified anti-aircraft defense system. By the time the B-29s began flying over the main islands, Japan no longer had the time, resources, or doctrine to adapt. The Nakajima J-1N1 Geku, its main night fighter, was an adaptation of a reconnaissance platform. It had limited armament, no onboard radar, and relied on ground operators who used acoustic detectors and searchlights to guide intercepts, methods obsolete in the face of the speed, altitude, and range of American bombers. The few aircraft available were poorly distributed, with little autonomy and even less effectiveness. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu exhibited good armament capabilities, but was slow and vulnerable at altitude. And even the most modern fighters, such as the Ki-61 Hien, did not have the range necessary to keep up with the B-29s in the standards imposed by the new American doctrine. The technical truth was clear. Japan was trying to stop rockets with fishing nets, and even these networks were broken. The number of operational night fighters in the entire archipelago at that time barely exceeded 200 aircraft. For comparison, the Tinian Air Base alone was capable of launching 150 B-29s in a single mission. The ratio was impractical, and there was still the fuel factor. The shortage of avgas had become critical. Many fighters remained on the ground not for lack of pilots, but for lack of kerosene. What little remained was reserved for interception operations as a last resort, or for future desperate attempts to prevent the envisaged Allied invasion. As a result, night training has become rare. Pilots were sent into the darkness with rudimentary maps, compromised vision, and no electronic support. Modern Japan fought as if it were the Japan of 1910, with courage but without systems. Tokyo, in this scenario, was a blind capital. With fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns to protect the entire metropolitan region, the gunners operated optical measuring instruments rather than firing radars. Most of the batteries were composed of 88mm and 120mm type parts, inherited from pre-war systems, without radar tracking, with reaction time incompatible with fast bombers and on alternate routes. Without effective early warning radar, civilians often only heard the attack warning when the first explosives had already detonated. Japanese air defense doctrine, at its core, was defensive on paper, but inoperative in practice. And yet, no one admitted the collapse. The High Command continued to believe in localized interceptions and inaccurate high-altitude bombings. They were prepared for a 1942 war. In 1945, this war no longer existed. The enemy had transformed. It was no longer an army. It was a supply chain, a research center, a spreadsheet that flew by. And in the case of Tokyo, this spreadsheet would descend less than 2,000 meters from the ground. But before the bombs fell, a decision had to be made: to dismantle the bombers themselves. Remove your weapons, fly lower, and turn defense engineering into pure destruction. This was the proposal of a general who believed that fear could not be negotiated, only set on fire. Curtis Emerson LeMay was not a man interested in symbols. For him, war was an equation, and victory was a function of destructive efficiency. When he took over 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, he inherited a stalled air campaign. High-altitude bombing, still based on the precision doctrine devised by the Air Corps, failed repeatedly. The jet stream displaced the bombs for miles. The clouds constant over the Japanese archipelago made visual aiming useless. The losses increased, the results decreased. LeMay saw what other generals were unwilling to admit. Accuracy in this theater was a myth, and the alternative was simple, brutal, and effective: download. Abandon the safe altitude, fly between 1,500 and 2,500 meters, face the heat, the flak, the risk. But with that, multiply the accuracy. The proposal went further. It ordered the withdrawal of most defensive weapons from the B-29s. Upper, side, front turrets, all removed. Less weight, more pumps. The only armament retained, the tail machine guns. The B-29s would now carry twice the incendiary payload. The crew, accustomed to flying with pressurized overalls and thermal insulation, would start to fly light, vulnerable, with minimal oxygen masks. The goal was to fly lower, faster, heavier. The sky was no longer a field of maneuver. It was just a corridor to the target. But LeMay went further. He saw in Japanese cities not only urban agglomerations, but pulverized production systems. Family workshops, small looms, home factories hidden among paper houses. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, no Japanese city clearly separated the civilian from the military. The war production was inside the homes. LeMay then decided to attack these zones directly. No understatement, no secondary justification. He assumed with unprecedented clarity that civilians supported the war. And to beat it, it would be necessary to break this gear. To do this, he would use not only bombs, he would use the weather. Meteorology has become his invisible ally. He studied the wind, humidity, and temperature patterns of the target cities. He identified that Tokyo in March was a powder keg of atmospheric constant surface winds, low humidity, flammable buildings, and an extreme population density. The city would become an oven if lit at the right point. In collaboration with military meteorologists, LeMay and his team chose the night of March 9-10 as the exact time. Clear skies, favorable wind, and critical humidity, but the weapon chosen for this experiment would not be explosive. It would be liquid, sticky, designed to stick in the chaos. Napalm. The logic was clear. Instead of destroying specific targets, the Americans would create a chain reaction of fires, a conflation, a self-sustaining hell where the winds would feed the flames and the flames would generate their own winds. LeMay called this full-fire logic. Instead of a bomb on a factory, it would be 1,500 simultaneous small hells. The concept turned air warfare into thermal engineering. And the most ironic thing is that while this was being executed with clinical precision, the enemy still expected attacks in formation at high altitude with demolition bombs. In Tokyo, no one knew that war was about to become a chemical reaction. At 5:35 p.m., the first B-29 took off from Guam. By the end of the night, 325 bombers would be in the air, each carrying what LeMay called the end of the line. But before the first napalm touched the ground, something even more meticulous would set the stage. The Pathfinders would mark the target with an X of fire, an X that would be seen for dozens of kilometers, an X that did not point to a command center but to the heart of a city where fire already lived. A city where, according to American calculations, 750,000 civilians lived, compressed into just 12 square miles. And that, according to LeMay, they would stop living in just a few hours. But what few knew was that, for this to happen, a weapon would need to behave exactly as predicted in the laboratory. A 6-pound metal cylinder would have to lie on the right roof, set off a cotton wick at just the right time, and spread fire with enough density to collapse an entire city. This weapon already had a name, and in Utah she had already set fire to perfect replicas of Japanese neighborhoods. Tokyo in 1945 was the capital of a warring power, but it remained architecturally rooted in the 19th century. More than 85% of the city's residential buildings were made of lightweight wood, with rice paper interior partitions and roofs covered in flammable materials. The narrow alleys, the population density, and the absence of urban breathing zones created a scenario almost unimaginable by Western standards. 750,000 people concentrated in less than 13 square miles, living side by side with small metallurgy, carpentry and aeronautical parts manufacturing workshops. The city was, without exaggeration, an urbanized woodshed, and the United States knew it. Before dropping the first bomb, American military engineers had already studied each block of the Japanese capital. Reports from the Office of Strategic Services, produced on the basis of captured urban maps and information from Japanese expatriates, ranked the districts by flammability, productive density, and population flow. Zones like Honjo, Fukagawa, and Asakusa were prioritized, not just because they were densely populated, but because they were home to a hidden economy. Thousands of small family-owned industries that produced gears, electrical components, and optical devices, all of which were essential to the Japanese war effort. These neighborhoods didn't just live, they manufactured. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Japan knew of the structural vulnerability of its capital since the Great Earthquake of 1923, which destroyed thousands of homes and caused catastrophic fires. It was even proposed after the disaster to create permanent fire breaks, wide avenues designed to prevent the spread of fire between neighborhoods, but the proposal was shelved for reasons of cost and expropriation. Decades later, the same mistake would return in much greater proportions. When napalm descended, there would be no urban obstacles capable of preventing sequential combustion. The fire would jump from one roof to the other in less than 2 minutes, and water channels, theoretically useful for firefighting, would become fatal traps. While American intelligence drew the collapse of the city in cartographic overlay, Japanese civil defense remained attached to community structures from the Taisho period. The city's firefighters, mostly volunteers, operated with buckets, manual hoses, and obsolete trucks. Only 286 motor vehicles were active in the entire city, many with water pressure capacity lower than necessary to contain large fires. Japan, limited by its scarcity of resources and the American naval blockade, simply did not have the means to equip a modern firefighting force. Most of the equipment was reminiscent of peacetime. The evacuation plans were theoretical and had not been tested on a large scale. The Japanese capital had become, by omission and pride, an ideal target. The people, instructed to use buckets of sand and damp blankets, were left to fend for themselves in the face of the most advanced ignition weapon in modern history. And when the attack finally began, these methods would prove as useless as arrows against steel. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts with depth and historical context, show your support. Like this video and subscribe. This helps us keep that memory alive, without filters or shortcuts. Because history, as we will see below, is not written with weapons alone, but with ignored decisions. And of all the decisions that brought Tokyo to the point of combustion, none was more precise, cooler, and more scientifically thought out than the construction of the incendiary bomb that would be dropped in 1,500 pieces on the city. A bomb that, curiously, was born in the laboratories of an American university, and it was tested in perfect replicas of Japanese neighborhoods in the middle of the desert. The M69 incendiary bombette was not the result of haste or improvisation. It was, on the contrary, a work of methodical engineering, developed with scientific patience and surgical precision. Created jointly by scientists from Harvard University and chemical engineers from Standard Oil, the M69 was a weapon that used fire as if it were thought. His design combined three elements: lightness, dispersion, and grip. The casing, a hexagonal steel cylinder about 50 centimeters long, weighed only 6 pounds. Inside, a plastic bag contained napalm in a gelatinous state, a highly flammable substance capable of attaching to any surface and burning at more than 1,000 degrees Celsius. But the secret of the M69 was in the way it behaved after launch. The bombette was packed into clusters, larger bombs, called E-46, each containing 38 M69s. When it reached 600 meters of altitude, the main envelope opened and dispersed the bombettes like seeds of fire. In the air, each one rotated and released a cotton ribbon with a counterweight, designed to guide the fall and position the impact fuse so that the internal load lay sideways, exactly as planned. The retarding wick would then burn for 3 to 5 seconds before detonating the white phosphorus, which in turn ignited the napalm. The result was a sweeping horizontal explosion that spread flames for up to 30 meters in all directions. Unlike explosive bombs, which destroyed by impact, the M69 invaded. It penetrated windows, fell on roofs, lodged in basements. The napalm stuck to the walls, seeped into the cracks, burned from the inside out. The fire moved like liquid, but reacted like gas. And that's exactly what the scientists were looking for: predictable, replicable, scalable behavior. To achieve this level of control, the Americans built exact replicas of Japanese blocks at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah in 1943. They used captured architectural plans, consulted with expatriate Japanese civil engineers, imported materials similar to those used in Tokyo's constructions. The houses were assembled with light boards, paper partitions, and furniture typical of urban residences. Each test was documented with millimeter precision: ignition time, propagation rate, resistance to extinction, average temperature per square meter. The results were then sent to the Army Corps of Engineers, which adjusted the dispersion parameters. The M69 wasn't made to scare, it was made to work, and it worked. The weapon was so effective that, according to internal reports, it needed only 2 units to start a fire in 80% of the homes targeted in the tests. With 38 bombs per cluster and 40 clusters per B-29, a single bomber carried more than 1,500 M69s. Multiplied by 279 aircraft that would hit Tokyo that night, the total reached 424,000 incendiary devices falling in a highly flammable area. The planners knew that with this density, the fire would cease to be an event. It would become an environment. The city would not burn. It would combust. That was the logic behind the project, not just to start fires, but to create a conflation, a massive fire sustained by its own thermal energy that would generate drafts so intense that the flames themselves would be sucked upwards, pulling oxygen from the surroundings and feeding in a cycle. Fire would become an organism, And the fuel was already in place. Houses, workshops, hoardings, fabrics, paper, dry wood. A continuous burning system, mapped and predicted in advance. While the Germans still relied on air doctrines based on accuracy and explosive power, the Americans had turned fire into a mathematical tool. The Nazis underestimated napalm. Japan would not have time to do the same. The M69 was more than a device. It was the ultimate application of the idea of scientific warfare. No improvisation, no tactical error. Only adjusted variables, climate monitored, load optimized. By the time the first B-29 crossed Mount Fuji, the entire system would be up and running, and at the center of it, a weapon made to be forgotten, because its purpose was not to be remembered. It was to work. The next day, no wooden structure would resist, and no defense system, no matter how modern, would be able to extinguish 424,000 simultaneous ignition spots. But before all hell broke loose, it was necessary to mark the target. A mark that could not be erased, that did not come with a siren nor with a warning, a letter set on fire in the heart of the capital, an X that said, "This is where the end begins." At 5:35 p.m., on March 9, 1945, the first B-29 took off from the Guam base. It was just the beginning. Over the next 5 hours, another 323 followed the same path, crossing the Pacific as an uninterrupted stream of steel, fuel, and calculus. Unlike traditional formations, which flew in groups for mutual defense, the bombers of Operation Meeting House were organized in a continuous line, one after the other, at regular intervals. The mission was not to hit, it was to saturate. At 11:35 p.m., the first Pathfinders crossed the Tokyo coast. Equipped with special white phosphorus incendiary bombs, they marked a gigantic X in flames in the center of Koto and Chuo districts. A luminous reference cross that, seen from above, seemed to dance in the wind. But the wind that night was not an ally. It was part of the weapon. The gusts came from the northeast, constant, calculated at 30 km/h. Exactly as predicted by LeMay's meteorologists, the ideal speed to spread fire horizontally without extinguishing it. When the M69 clusters began to be launched, the sky over Tokyo was still clear, but the ground was already burning. And then, the city disappeared. The fires started as isolated patches, but in less than 20 minutes, the spotlights connected. The flames jumped streets, entered through the windows, exploded basements. The average temperature in the affected areas exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. Oxygen was sucked violently by the updrafts. The streets, once refuges, have become tunnels of fire. Entire families tried to escape into the canals, but the heat evaporated the water faster than one could dive. Children suffocated before screaming. The sound of the bombardment was not like that of explosions. It was muffled, continuous, a deep roar, interspersed with dry cracks of collapsing roofs. The gas masks of the civil defense melted on his face. The uniforms of civilian firefighters, made of thick fabric, became thermal armor, but only for minutes. Some trucks tried to push against the incandescent tide, but the tires melted before the second corner. At certain points, the winds generated by the firestorm reached 160 km/h. The city spontaneously combusted. The asphalt gave way. The trees exploded from the inside. The X marked by the Pathfinders became a thermal vacuum core. Everything around was sucked in. One witness described the phenomenon as a swirl that smelled of burnt hair and tears. There was no way to react. There was nowhere to run. The underground shelters collapsed due to lack of oxygen. Some died of asphyxiation before the heat reached them. Others tried to dig under the mats, hiding from the embers, unaware that the fire was also coming from below. Within 3 hours, more than 100,000 people were dead. And among the bodies were seamstresses, craftsmen, engravers, turners, the same ones who, days earlier, had finished parts for Kaietti 4 fighters and Navy torpedoes. Tokyo, both city and factory, had been shut down. What the Germans called strategic destruction had become, in American hands, an atmospheric science. It wasn't just air superiority, it was environmental superiority. Control the wind, measure humidity, convert urban map into thermal vector. The city was not defeated, it was deleted, and while the ash was still rising, Allied radios picked up absolute silence on Japanese frequencies. But in the hours that followed, a confession from a captured Japanese pilot would reveal something even more disconcerting. Tokyo had not been attacked by ordinary bombers. According to him, it seemed the end of the world made in a laboratory. Yoshiko Hashimoto woke up to a sound she didn't recognize. It was not an explosion. It wasn't a siren. It was like the crackling of red-hot wood, but too loud to come from a single house. She ran to the paper window and saw the sky pulsing in shades of orange and black. She took her son in her arms and screamed for her husband, who was already trying to carry his elderly mother-in-law out of the residence. The heat came from all sides, even with the fire still far away. It was as if the city breathed flames. The street where they lived, in Honjo, was already filled with smoke before the first bomb fell directly on them. The roof blew off before they could get through the gate. The napalm entered through the back window. Yoshiko didn't have time to think. She ran. With the baby clutched to his chest and his bare feet on the boiling asphalt, he crossed 3 blocks amid flames that jumped out of the alleys. The screams came from all sides, short, choked. The air burned before being inhaled. She tried to follow the crowd towards the Sumida River, the last possible refuge, but at every corner she found walls of fire. At the intersection of Asakusa Street and Kototoi, he saw a burning truck collapse on a group of civilians. He heard a voice screaming for water, then nothing else. Yoshiko hid behind a brick wall and wrapped the baby with her own body. He tried to wet a handkerchief with saliva to cover the child's face, but there was no saliva left. The heat dried everything out. When he finally reached the banks of the Sumida, he found more than 1,000 people trying the same. Entire families in the water up to their necks, children on improvised boards, bodies being carried away by the current. She dived, still with her son strapped to her chest. The thermal shock of the icy water saved his body, but not his consciousness. For hours he clung to a piece of wood and watched his city go up in smoke. Her husband never arrived. Neither did his mother-in-law. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that same night, the operation that burned down her street had been programmed based on demographic data. The maps showed where there was the highest concentration of wooden residences per square meter. The dispersion algorithms of the M69 had been adjusted to reach areas with a density of more than 40,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. The destruction was not random. It was directed, and Yoshiko was right at the center of that equation. An equation made with logic, not hatred. While Germany still believed in strategic campaigns by points, such as Coventry, London, or Leningrad, the United States already operated on an algorithmic scale. American production of incendiary bombs exceeded the Luftwaffe's total ammunition-making capacity by 5 times that year. 5 times. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, logistics wins. Because winning, for Americans, was a matter of volume and precision, not just courage or talent. And in this respect, the war was already defined even before the first bomb fell. Yoshiko survived, but his house turned to ashes. Her husband became a statistic, and her son, who that night had his lungs injured by the toxic fumes, would never breathe again without pain. In post-war records, her name appears only once, in a Red Cross refugee census, and even that record was poorly filled out. But his account, delivered years later to a Hiroshima reporter, still carries the phrase that defines that night more than any military report. Tokyo burned as if it had been made for this. But there was still more. Because while Yoshiko struggled to survive, in Washington, technicians and generals evaluated the results with tables, And the numbers didn't just confirm the success, they hinted at something even bigger. A formula for urban destruction had been found. And the next target, according to calculations, would be Nagoya. At dawn on March 10, 1945, while the ashes were still dancing over what was once the urban heart of the Japanese Empire, the military high command in Tokyo was trying to make sense of what had happened. Not officially, of course, silence was doctrine, but behind the scenes at the imperial headquarters, what was seen was a cognitive breakdown. The Army's initial report highlighted the extent of the destruction. 15-square-mile area completely charred. The Navy's was more laconic. Catastrophic loss. None of them, however, dared to admit the obvious. The country had lost control of its own sky. The air defenses failed. The doctrine failed. The logic of moral resistance, the ideological basis of the regime, began to crumble. In public, the emperor remained silent. In private, his closest advisers discussed how to hide the scope of the destruction from the population, but there was no way to hide it. Tokyo, once a showcase of national pride, had become a symbolic crater of the bankruptcy of an entire system. The population, exhausted, no longer responded to the government's appeals. While leaflets continued to promise victory and dignity, the eyes of the victims sought only refuge. The propaganda spoke of sacrifice. But those who had lost everything just wanted to survive. For the first time, fissures began to be noticed between the people and the military elite. Families that once preached the values of Bushido now looked suspiciously at their own leaders. In Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, murmurs of disobedience began to emerge. Small, still silent, but unacceptable for a regime built on absolute obedience. The official response came in the form of symbolic reinforcement. More flags, more slogans, more civilian training with bamboo spears. While the United States refined fire behavior, Japan trained children to fight tanks. The comparison was painful but inevitable. Germany, an ideological ally, faced a similar collapse in Berlin. But even Goebbels would acknowledge months later that Japan was fighting a war it no longer understood. At a General Staff meeting on March 13th, a Japanese Air Force official reportedly said in a low voice, "They are not attacking targets. They are erasing the map." The phrase has not been officially registered, but it was repeated among the generals as an omen, because they knew that Nagoya was on the route. They knew they had no way to prevent it. What's more, they knew that the city's factories were surrounded by houses, just like in Tokyo, exactly as predicted in the American manuals. The Japanese doctrine, based on the honor of direct combat, sacrifice for the land, and purity of spirit, had no antidote to bombs that thought like engineers. There was no honor in burning to death in the basement of one's own house. And there was no glory possible in the face of a technology that did not make mistakes. Japan's response was to keep going, because to stop would be to admit total bankruptcy. But each bomb that fell revealed not only the enemy's industrial advance, but the distance between a mythological empire and a brutal military reality. And this reality would soon reach other cities. But before that, one name would appear in American spreadsheets with special prominence: Osaka, the second most important city in the country, the next one to be measured, marked, and incinerated. The morning of March 10th dawned grey, not by fog, but by human and urban particles suspended in the air. Tokyo, Japan's largest city, did not wake up. It emerged from the rubble as a spectre of itself. Where there were once pulsating avenues, there were trails among piles of ash. The signs were gone, the urban landmarks melted, the colors disappeared. Everything was dark dust, residual heat, and the smell of charred flesh. Thousands of bodies lay where the fire had surprised them, women with children still strapped to their arms, elderly people hugging in makeshift trenches, workers with tools cast in their hands. There were dead on the rooftops, inside the canals, on the melted sidewalks. The heat was so intense that it vitrified the bricks of some facades. At certain points, the identification of the bodies became impossible. The families recognized their loved ones by what was left of the belongings: a brooch, a sandal, a piece of clothing that resisted combustion. Entire schools disappeared. Of Tokyo's 276 public schools, 132 were completely destroyed that night. Historic temples such as Sensoji have become piles of black wood. Civilian hospitals, marked with crosses visible from the air, did not escape the random spread of the fire. And when they were not directly hit, they were suffocated by neighboring flames, collapsing from lack of oxygen. In the underground shelters, what remained were bodies huddled together in despair, many with their skin fused to the concrete walls. The silence that dominated the city was deafening. There were no more horns, bicycles, radios, or shouts. Just the slow sound of ashes falling, like black snow on a desert of loss. Survivors wandered aimlessly, many in shock, others searching for names amid the rubble. Children walked alone, calling for their parents, not understanding that they had lost everything. Those who had weathered the firestorm now faced a greater void: absence. Absence of home, of memory, of reference. Entire streets had disappeared from the map. Iconic sites, such as the Nihonbashi business district, have been reduced to indistinct rubble. Civil maps were no longer useful for navigation. It was necessary to redesign the city. But how do you redesign a trauma? Rescuers, when they finally gained access to the central areas, reported scenes that were impossible to document. In a report by the Civil Defense Army, one officer described, "I have never seen silence weigh so heavily. Every step on the ash seemed to invade a mortuary chamber without walls. The metal structures of trams and twisted bridges indicated the intensity of the heat. Conservative estimates suggest that more than 1 million residents have been left homeless. Some neighborhoods, such as Kameido and Fukagawa, have simply ceased to exist. No building remained standing, no trees, no landmark. The fire didn't destroy it, it did. And this erasure was not accidental. It was methodical, statistical. The American operation predicted a rate of urban destruction of 40 to 50%, but the results in Tokyo exceeded 60%. The effectiveness of the mission was so far beyond expectations that it generated discomfort in part of the Allied command. Not because of the excess of death, but because of the precision. The city had been treated as a variable in an experiment, and the experiment worked. At the Dugway Proving Ground in the deserts of Utah, engineers were already celebrating the confirmation of their models. The behavior of the fire, the estimated spread, the time of collapse of the structures, everything went as planned. No war simulation had ever become such an exact reality. But while the data was confirmed, the reality on Japanese soil was different. Entire families searched for names on makeshift lists, set up in schools transformed into temporary shelters. Survivors drew maps of their own neighborhood from memory, trying to locate relatives or objects that could prove their identity. On one of these lists, the name of Yoshiko Hashimoto appears again, now registered as child under medical care, moderate burns. That was it. 2 lines. For those who lost everything, a fragment of existence was what remained. Tokyo, the city that once symbolized Japan's modernization, now represented its turning point. And what was even more impressive was the contrast. While the Japanese capital turned to ashes, American factories were already producing the next batches of bombs, at an industrial pace. No pause, no shortage. The attack on the capital had been only the first field test of the new doctrine. And if this doctrine worked in Tokyo, why not replicate it in Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama? The assembly line of destruction had been activated. But there was one city in particular that attracted the attention of the Allied command. A vital industrial center with a dense civilian population and urban layout similar to that of the capital. a city that, in American reports, was already treated not as if, but as when. This city was called Nagoya. Observing the devastated landscape of Tokyo, a layman might believe that the attack was indiscriminate, an act of aerial rage against a civilian city. But the strategic maps said something else. Among the ashes of the Koto, Asakusa, and Fukagawa neighborhoods were not just homes. They were gears, literally. Precision workshops, small foundries, artisanal bearing factories, rudimentary circuit boards, optical lenses, and hydraulic mechanisms had been set up over the years inside homes and improvised sheds. It was what the Americans called decentralized production, integrated into the urban fabric. Tokyo wasn't just a city. It was a fragmented power plant, and on that single night, more than half of those units were permanently silenced. The impact was technical, and it was total. Before the attack, it was estimated that more than 26% of Japanese aircraft components were produced by factories with fewer than 20 employees. Parts for Nakajima engines, circuitry for Ki-84 fighter instruments, and optical systems for G4M bombers were manufactured in familiar networks, hidden among convenience stores and temples. They were structures invisible to the unsuspecting eye, but essential to sustaining the imperial war machine. The March 9 offensive reached 56% of these units, a number that would completely paralyze the production of spare parts for weeks. Without parts, there was no maintenance. Without maintenance, there was no flight. And without flight, the sky belonged to the enemy. The meeting house operation was designed for this. It wasn't just horror, it was reverse engineering. American strategists did not target factories with fences and chimneys. They targeted streets with productive density per square meter. In the spreadsheets, districts were prioritized by the number of hot spots of dispersed war activity. Each M69 cluster was launched based on this metric. Behind the smoke, there was an algorithm. The data would confirm it. Within 30 days of the attack, the production of electrical components for airplanes had fallen by 44%. Optical parts, 62%. Mechanical instrumentation, 48%. Some chains were irreversibly broken. A disappearing gear in Fukagawa paralyzed an entire line in Osaka. Modern warfare was not just about targets. It was about interdependence, and the United States had figured out how to nip it in the bud. The U.S. Bureau of Military Intelligence, in a confidential April 1945 report, stated with surgical precision, Japan continues to try to manufacture airplanes in a logistical network that no longer exists. It was no longer necessary to destroy the airfields. It was enough to interrupt the flow of parts. A burned-out wheel loader in Tokyo was paralyzing an assembly belt in Nagoya. A lathe that disappeared with the fire disabled an entire batch of propellers in Fukuoka. And even when the main structures of the factories survived, there was a lack of workers, because the workforce had burned along with the neighborhoods. More than 70,000 civilian workers in the arms industry were killed or injured in the offensive. They were anonymous workers without uniforms, but as essential as any general. Their names did not enter the military bulletins, but their absence redefined the course of the war. The Japanese doctrine, based on decentralization, improvisation, and sacrifice, found its limit in the face of Allied logistical precision. And while Japan improvised with hammers and oaths of allegiance, the United States adjusted chemical formulas and calibrated dispersers. The war of beliefs was being won by a spreadsheet. The final irony was this: the bombings, apparently barbaric, were of a mathematical rationality that Japan did not foresee. Because unlike the Luftwaffe's terror campaigns or Soviet reprisals, the Americans did not bomb to scare. They bombed to deactivate, and they succeeded. In less than 6 hours, Tokyo lost 50% of its industrial air support capacity. In a war that depended on air, this meant only one thing: fall. But what Japan did not yet know is that the same engineers behind the destruction of Tokyo were already preparing a weapon with an even more definitive objective. A weapon that didn't need 300 planes. One that would fit in a single compartment, and that it would not only burn wood, it would dissolve atoms. The war waged by the United States against Japan in 1945 was not a war like the ones Japan had imagined. While samurai doctrine emphasized honor, personal sacrifice, and courage in combat, American strategy was based on a precision that went beyond bombs. It was a war of spreadsheets, tables, and exact calculations. Every step, every movement, every target was designed based on numerical data and statistical models. Behind each bombing was a scientific war machine powered by engineers, mathematicians, and meteorologists. Instead of relying on improvisation like Japan, the United States created an army of numbers. Each attack was preceded by weeks of analysis. Military meteorologists studied atmospheric conditions with pinpoint precision. The simulations of fire dispersion were done in laboratories. Urban maps, captured by spies and refugees, were analyzed to identify the areas with the highest concentration of industrial activities, not just the military. With this, American planners knew where to attack, how to attack, and most importantly, when to attack. They didn't make assumptions, they were sure. Operation Meeting House, which destroyed Tokyo on March 9th, was a precise application of this scientific approach. The numbers indicated that northeasterly winds at 30 km/h were ideal for spreading the flames without dissipating them, and that's what happened. The fire did not dissipate. It spread from roof to roof, fueled by perfectly predicted weather conditions. The M69 incendiary bombs, designed to maximize fire dispersal, were dropped with just the right amount of fuel to ensure that the inferno spread in a controlled and relentless manner. The destruction was not random, but planned. Now compare that to Germany's approach. While the US created models based on simulations of destruction, the Germans still relied on antiquated methods of attack, focusing on bomb accuracy and targeted attacks. American production of B-29 heavy bombers, for example, was 10 times greater than that of the Luftwaffe. Yes, 10 times. And that was not just a numerical advantage, but an overwhelming tactical and strategic advantage. While the Germans were discussing the effectiveness of a single bomber or specialized fighters, the United States was already operating hundreds of aircraft on coordinated missions as part of a mass production system unparalleled in history. If this surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly what happened. The war was won not on the battlefield, but in the factories, the calculating tables, and the primitive computers that predicted the behavior of fire, the spread of heat, and the dispersion of each bomb. Japan, for its part, followed a logic of resistance based on courage and sacrifice. Japanese defenses were not based on numbers and data, but on doctrines of honor, where each pilot was prepared for combat to the death. There was no room for statistics in his model of warfare. Meanwhile, the American war machine was already assembled in a perfect gear system where every piece from bomber design to wind forecasting had a crucial role to play. And this system wasn't just destroying cities, it was destroying an entire ideology. When the US Air Forces began bombing Tokyo, they already knew the outcome. And the mathematical accuracy of the attacks was not a coincidence. It was the culmination of a war waged in laboratories. Now Tokyo's numbers spoke for themselves. With the bombing of March 9th, the United States had managed to destroy 56% of Japan's industrial capacity for urban war production. By comparison, Germany's precision tactics, while initially effective, could not compete with the vast American industrial output that seemed endless. Japan still believed that its resistance would be enough, but the war of numbers was far from over. The next city on the list was already marked, and the United States, now sure of the effectiveness of its techniques, was already preparing to attack Nagoya. But as the numbers showed, the real destruction was not only in the bombs, it was in the way the Americans engineered this destruction. And this scientific operation would make no distinction between civilians and military. In the final calculation, all would be targets. On March 9, 1945, the destruction of Tokyo was not just the result of a militarily efficient bombing campaign. It was also an avoidable tragedy, amplified by the failure of leadership, bureaucratic inertia, and denial by the Japanese authorities. While the United States perfected its destruction tactics with meticulous planning, Japan, by contrast, remained mired in chaotic management, hostage to a military administration that failed to respond adequately to the magnitude of the threat it faced. The idea of building fire breaks, or fire barriers, had already been raised after the Great Earthquake of 1923, when Tokyo was almost consumed by uncontrolled fires. At the time, engineers suggested building wide avenues, open areas, and containment zones to prevent the fires from spreading uncontrollably. But the military high command, more concerned with preserving public order and the appearance of power, rejected these suggestions. The high cost and impact on peripheral neighborhoods were seen as an obstacle to the preservation of traditional urban space. Decades later, the result of this failure was obvious. A dense city with narrow streets, with no defenses against a large-scale fire. And when the first bombings took place, traditional Japanese firefighting methods, composed largely of civilian brigades, were ineffective. In many cases, the population was left alone, fighting the fire with buckets of water and bamboo spears. More than 8,000 firefighters were registered in Tokyo, but the vast majority did not have adequate equipment to deal with fires of this magnitude. By the time the flames engulfed neighborhoods, fire brigades were in a state of panic, being overwhelmed by the extreme heat and how quickly the fire spread. Military and local authorities tried to control the damage with makeshift schemes, but were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the catastrophe. The most shocking thing was the complete absence of an effective evacuation plan. The emergency maps that existed were old and did not consider the population density of the neighborhoods, nor the safety conditions of escape routes. Instead, the military prioritized protecting public buildings and government structures, something that seemed more urgent than saving civilian lives. While government buildings and military areas were defended with all the apparatus available, the neighborhoods where millions of civilians lived were completely unprotected, with no kind of organized plan to face the air attack or the subsequent fire. Families tried to flee to shelters but were forced to walk through the burning streets, their paths blocked by rubble and dense smoke. The shelters were not equipped for the size of the tragedy. Even the few underground shelters designed to withstand air raids were saturated and could not cope with the number of people trying to escape hell on the surface. Some shelters ended up becoming death traps, with people trapped and suffocated due to lack of oxygen. In addition, Japanese leaders had been warned about the destructive potential of a massive air attack with incendiary bombs, but still chose to ignore these warnings. The Japanese resistance was not only in its combative spirit, but also in the way it shielded itself against any external reality. At meetings of the General Staff, where air warfare was discussed, warnings that Japanese cities could be destroyed by napalm bombing were downplayed, with the justification that the resistance of the Japanese defenses would be sufficient. This kind of thinking has led to an underestimation of U.S. logistical and industrial capability, and more importantly, an inability to adapt national defense effectively. The Japanese government insisted on a system of self-sufficiency that, as admirable as it was in theory, was simply impractical in practice. The U.S., for its part, had understood how to attack not only the Japanese military forces, but the industrial structure that supported them, and the impact of that was destructive. But worst of all was the reaction of the Japanese government. blind resistance fueled by ideology, denial of reality, and blind trust in traditions. The military vision was based on the belief that honor and sacrifice would guarantee the survival of the nation. But none of this could protect a city made of wood, without contingency plans, without modern infrastructure, and without even an effective defense system against air attacks. The morning of March 10th revealed the bankruptcy of this ideology. While the flames still consumed the city, the Japanese leadership continued to cling to pride and the strategy of resistance. But in fact, it was already clear that the war had changed. The technology of war, meticulously and scientifically applied by the United States, had defeated Japan's ideology of uncompromising resistance. And in the desolate backdrop of Tokyo, the real defeat lay not just in the death toll, but in the failure of a leadership that never recognized the true nature of the enemy. As Japan bid farewell to its ashes, a new form of warfare, calculated, scientific, ruthless, was spreading across the Pacific, unbeatable in its precision. However, the eyes of the Japanese High Command were not yet fully opened. The destruction of Tokyo had been a warning. But as Americans already knew, the worst was yet to come, and the next target would be a city crucial to Japan's war industry, Nagoya. After the destruction of Tokyo, Japan would never be the same. It was no longer just about the scars left on the streets and buildings, but in the minds of everyone who survived. The city, once vibrant and full of life, had become a field of ruins, and with it, the morale of a nation. The concept of routine air raid, which once sounded like a distant and rare warning, has become the daily reality of the population. With each siren, panic took over, but not only the physical panic of escape, the psychological fear that the next time might be the last, or that when she arrived at the shelter, she would find herself in a fiery hell again. For the survivors, uncertainty came to dominate every aspect of their existence. The urban population began to migrate en masse to the countryside, trying to escape the reach of the bombings, but there was no longer a safe place. Factories, once the beating heart of the Japanese economy, have become scenes of desperation. The workers, many of whom had lost family members, were without the strength to work. In many Tokyo factories, war production had all but stopped. The exodus to the countryside drove the cities into a state of social disintegration, a mass flight that further weakened Japan's resilience. Japan had not only lost Tokyo, it had lost confidence in the future. The official propaganda, which had previously preached that victory was near, now rang hollow. The promises of resistance to the end began to fade away, as the population no longer believed in the words of the leaders. The void left by leadership failure has not been filled by new leaders or new ideas, but by a collective desperation. The official narratives of an invincible Japan began to crumble as refugees, their eyes void of hope, spread across the country stories of mass destruction and a war that seemed endless. The words of one man, a Japanese officer who had survived the hell of Tokyo, would echo as a grim portrayal of reality. We were not defeated on the battlefield. We were defeated by smoke. And this smoke was not just physical. It represented the loss of the spirit of an entire nation. No matter how much the government tried to restore trust or keep up appearances, the reality was clear. The population was already morally destroyed. Japan had already been defeated, but not on the battlefield. The real defeat was the one that took place within the minds of millions of Japanese who had witnessed their own destruction. The collective trauma, fueled by months of airstrikes, had shaken the foundations of society. Morality slowly but irreversibly disintegrated. Factories that once built confidence and productivity were now paralyzed by grief and uncertainty. Japan's military ideology, based on resistance and sacrifice, seemed like a distant memory as the reality of death and destruction took over daily life. In the refugee camps, Many survivors said that the greatest enemy was not the enemy planes, but the inner pain, the sense of loss that ran far deeper than any physical injury. The destruction had not only been physical, it had left an emotional and psychological vacuum, a gap that the authorities did not know how to fill. The real tragedy was just beginning. The devastation that had begun in Tokyo now spread throughout the nation. The government tried to resist the pressure, but the strength of national morale was already broken. Japan was about to face an impossible dilemma. And while smoke still hung in the air, a new threat would emerge to replace the old one. Not from bombers, but from the very lack of hope. What the Japanese didn't know was that America was about to deliver the final blow with a weapon that didn't need a battlefield. A silent, invisible weapon that was now being prepared to change Japan's destiny forever, and the next attack soon would no longer depend on incendiary bombs. After the hell of Tokyo, the war took a different, more systematic, more impersonal form. What once seemed like an unforeseen act of fury now became a programmed, meticulously planned, and most terrifying, predictable operation. The attack on Tokyo was just the first in a series of firebombings that would engulf 66 Japanese cities over a period of months. Each attack was no longer a response to Japan's military actions, but an administrative decision, a scientific military routine coordinated from maps and statistics. The concept of programmed destruction was developed in part by the experience of the night of March 9th. The effectiveness of the meeting house operation in Tokyo in destroying more than 50% of urban industrial capacity in a single night led the Americans to refine their technique. Now, the destruction was not only necessary, but it was part of a broader plan of strategic annihilation. Each Japanese city had its own fire report based on population density, industrial concentrations, and ideal weather conditions. Planning was done weeks in advance, with details that indicated precisely when and how the fire would spread. In a paradoxical form of warfare, attacks were mostly announced. The United States distributed warning pamphlets to the target cities. The Japanese government, for its part, tried to keep the population on the streets in a futile effort of resistance, but in fact, the resistance was no longer on the battlefield. The resistance was in the concept of war that Japan maintained, a conflict in which it was believed that honor and sacrifice could defeat the enemy. And as Japan resisted, the future of the war became increasingly clear. Japanese cities would lose their right to exist, being erased, not by direct military force, but by the programmed certainty of their destruction. The change in the nature of the conflict was, in itself, a reflection of the evolution of the industrial and technological capabilities of the United States. The war had turned into an urban war of extermination, in which every move and every attack followed a scientific and industrial logic. It was no longer a question of facing a military enemy, but of destroying the very structure that supported the Japanese war machine. And the worst thing was that this transformation did not surprise the Americans. On the contrary, they were just beginning to put in place a more definitive approach. The moral of the conflict had changed. What had once been a battle for victory now became a methodical operation to eliminate any trace of resistance. And this was a war that no longer had honor, no sacrifice. Tokyo had only been the first city. Nagoya, Osaka, and others followed the same fate, a sequence of destruction that seemed somehow inevitable. The concept of war, of combat and resistance, was being dismantled, one attack at a time. Japan already knew that its greatest threat was not in the bombers visible in the sky, but in the spreadsheets, wind forecasts, meteorological calculations, and the exact calculation of when the city would lose its function. The war had become an urban extermination operation, where time was the only missing factor to complete the job. And in the midst of this, the Japanese consciousness was beginning to realize something even deeper. It was not just the physical destruction of cities, but the loss of the idea of a unified nation. Japan no longer resisted, but awaited its next scheduled extinction. After the devastation of Tokyo and so many other Japanese cities, a question emerged from the ashes. Who, in fact, would be held responsible for such destruction? As Axis leaders, including German military commanders, faced trials at Nuremberg, the question of the morality and legality of American strategic bombing seemed to dissolve into the clouds of smoke that had taken over the Tokyo sky. The international trial, which followed the defeat of the Axis, focused mainly on the atrocities committed by the regimes of Hitler and Mussolini, with the execution of extermination policies in concentration camps and systematic practices of genocide. But the silence about the victors' actions seemed all the more incomprehensible the more one analyzed the magnitude of their own actions during the war. The 1907 Hague Convention, which discussed the limits of war and the protection of civilians, was disregarded when it came to large-scale air raids. The Americans justified their actions on the basis of military necessity, a doctrine that allowed the destruction of civilian targets if it was deemed essential to victory in the war. Under this justification, civilian casualties were no longer collateral damage, but part of a strategic logic. But where was the line between military necessity and what could be interpreted as pure revenge, or at the very least, excessive destruction? In the case of Curtis LeMay, the commander responsible for intensifying the firebombing campaign, he himself was never held responsible for his decisions. Even when the destruction and results of his strategy, the elimination of entire cities, became obvious, LeMay was promoted, with little questioning about the morality of his tactics. In an interview after the war, LeMay even coldly stated that if the US had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. However, he did not regret his actions. What was most shocking, however, was not only the indifference of those responsible, but the fact that, after the victory, the moral analysis of these attacks was never properly conducted. US. Industrial and logistical supremacy had secured victory, but did that exempt them from being held accountable for their tactical choices? The answer that was imposed was that victory in itself became a justification for the means used to achieve it. The concept of military necessity was used to justify the unjustifiable. What was once considered a war crime became an exercise in strategic prudence, an action accepted under the cloak of all-out war, where any means were valid to achieve victory. For the Allies, especially the US, the end of the war brought a re-examination of their policies, but without the repercussions that accompanied the Nuremberg trials. The historical irony reveals itself here. While the defeated faced war crimes charges for attacks on civilians, the victors, whose actions caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, did not face similar trials. This raises a crucial question. Does victory in a war grant impunity to those who use disproportionate and devastating means? Unlike the Nazis, who tried to justify their atrocities on the basis of radical ideals and a twisted nationalism, Americans used the war as a justification for the systematic elimination of entire cities. But that didn't make the attacks any less immoral. They were only hiding under the guise of a necessary victory. Throughout the decades that followed, American firebombing continued to be treated as a legitimate line of defense, but the morality behind these decisions remained largely unreflected. The invisible judgment on the actions of leaders like LeMay was never realized, and their war strategy was, in practice, legitimized by victory. But, as LeMay has already warned in his words, history has a cruel way of reversing roles, and in the future, this same war of systematic destruction would eventually spawn a wave of reassessment that would have implications for all involved. The victors would eventually be confronted with the truth that, however much they had won, some of their tactics were as devastating as any other act committed by the Axis regime. This reflection, albeit belated, would begin to take shape in the following decades, when the war would once again be measured not only by the numbers of dead, but by the weight of morality and the clarity of intentions. And soon, the issue of moral judgment would come to the fore, with more force than ever. After World War II, the world focused on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two Japanese cities that suffered the nuclear attacks. The mass destruction caused by atomic bombs became, and still are, symbols of the devastating power of the new era of war. But something has remained in the shadow of this narrative: the destruction of Tokyo, the largest and deadliest air offensive of the war, with more than 100,000 killed in a single night. In contrast to the atomic catastrophe, the Tokyo firebombing was almost erased from Western memory. There were no films, books, or global campaigns that captured the scale of suffering that unfolded on the streets of the Japanese capital on that night in March 1945. The absence of collective memory about this event, unlike the nuclear attacks, is not a simple coincidence. The destruction of Tokyo was in many ways an unacknowledged catastrophe, especially in the West, which preferred to focus on the narrative about nuclear weapons. The reason behind this forgetfulness can be seen in the way the post-war world wished to deal with its own guilt and the morality of its actions. Atomic bombs, while deadly and devastating, were new, and the nuclear age came to dominate conversations about the morality of war. The concept of military necessity, which was used to justify the bombing of urban areas, such as Tokyo, in the name of victory, was diluted in the face of the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which used weapons hitherto unimaginable. This contrast between the two types of destruction, one caused by conventional military force and the other by nuclear science, has created a dividing line in historical memory. While the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had their story told and widely publicized, the survivors of Tokyo, many of whom lost everything and witnessed unspeakable horrors, struggled for decades to be heard. Their reports, long ignored, did not find a space of respect equal to that of the nuclear victims. It was only years later that one man, Katsumoto Saotome, decided that the memory of Tokyo could not disappear. A survivor who lost part of his family that night, Saotome began gathering accounts from other survivors and collecting artifacts from the city's ruins. The Tokyo Center of Remembrance, which he founded, sought to restore the stories of those whose voices were drowned out by the magnitude of the atomic attacks. The mission of Saotome and others like him was simple but powerful: to ensure that Tokyo's suffering was not forgotten, not diminished or erased by official history. His struggle was a journey against silence, an effort to give visibility to a tragedy that, while not nuclear, was equally devastating. Saotome's work challenged the idea that atomic attacks alone had changed the nature of modern warfare. He believed, rightly, that Tokyo's incendiary war was a prelude, an anticipation of the destructive power that would be unleashed by nuclear bombs. Burnt Tokyo, with its city turned to ashes and its streets overrun with bodies, was a lesson in what industrial and logistical capabilities can do when used on a full scale. The bombing of Tokyo, more than any other event, showed that modern warfare was not just about fighting, but about systematically annihilating the enemy, where science, technology, and numbers took the place of brute force. Despite everything, the memory of Tokyo was silenced. The global narrative preferred to build a discourse around the nuclear age, leaving aside the suffering of cities that, although not affected by radiation, had been equally obliterated. But the stories from Tokyo have not disappeared. They survived on the work of Saotome and other survivors who refused to let the city's memory fade. And as the world reflected on the horrors of nuclear war, the question of how to remember the victims of Tokyo, such a silent tragedy, began to emerge as the truth opened up over the years. The oblivion, however, is not definitive. The silence on Tokyo is slowly being broken. But what it does reveal is the fact that quiet tragedies, however forgotten, continue to shape the world just as much as those that rise to prominence. What Tokyo survivors like Sayotomi taught us was that memory, even when erased, can be restored, but the cost of such forgetting never goes away. The history of Tokyo and the silence that enveloped it are only one part of an even larger narrative about the morality of war, which would begin to be questioned in a new era. And as Japan began to rebuild, the world began to face the consequences of its war choices. What would happen next, when other cities began to wake up to the weight of destruction, would be an even more disconcerting revelation. After the inferno that befell Tokyo, what was left was not only physical destruction, but the deep void left in the souls of the survivors. For those who, like Yoshiko Hashimoto, lived through the catastrophe, the impact was not only the loss of relatives and homes, but an irreversible transformation in the understanding of humanity itself. Widows, orphans, entire families missing, neighborhoods that had existed for generations now reduced to ashes. All of these became part of the invisible legacy of that war. Yoshiko, along with so many others, continued her life, but with a burden that could never be put into words. The trauma was not limited to the moment of the explosion or the scream of the last siren. It resided in the sleepless nights, the memories of the now destroyed streets, the bodies that could no longer be identified, and the unanswered questions about the fate of loved ones. She escaped with her son, but the pain of losing her family would never dissipate. And like her, millions of Japanese carried scars in their hearts that time could never erase. The responsibility, however, does not fall only on those who directly suffered the attacks. The survivors, especially those who lost everything and moved on with their lives, were left with a silence they could not share. Modern warfare, with its technical power, has succeeded in destroying not only cities, but entire lives, erasing an essential part of a nation's identity. The consequences of a war fought on the basis of data, numbers and simulations are not limited to the immediate moment of destruction. They span generations. The psychological trauma caused by these attacks was not just about what was lost, but about what was dehumanized in those moments. Japan found itself facing a rupture, not just of its cities, but of its own vision of itself. The concept of combat, the idea that war was a fight between combatants, no longer existed. Now the line between civilians and military was blurred. Modern warfare showed its most brutal and callous face. Civilians, who had once been protected by international conventions, were now targeted. But who decided what was needed? Who drew the lines of morality? The technical intelligence that had planned the incendiary bombings and that had conducted the destruction of Tokyo so precisely had no room for emotional considerations. The only goal was victory. But victory came at a price, and that price was not just in the tons of bombs dropped, but in the invisible but profound wear and tear that affected every life touched by the war. Yoshiko and other survivors represented the face of a Japan struggling to recover from the devastation, but the cure would not come from material reconstruction. True healing would come from reflection, from the ability to remember and learn from the lessons of the past. War, with its destructive power and ability to push moral boundaries, required something more than technical intelligence to understand. It required a historical consciousness, an understanding of what it meant to be human in the face of such destruction. And it is this reflection that is crucial for the future, not only to prevent the horrors of war from being repeated, but to ensure that the scars left on the souls of nations, on the souls of survivors, can eventually begin to heal. Technical intelligence can engineer destruction accurately, but it is historical consciousness that has the power to restore humanity. Japan, like many other war-affected nations, would need more than physical reconstruction. He would need to face his past, learn from it, and eventually find the strength to heal himself. But what was still missing, and what the victors of the war, with their selective morality, also had to confront, was the recognition that there were no complete winners in a war of such a scale. The United States, which had imposed an unprecedented victory with its industrial and scientific capabilities, also had to deal with the morality of its choices. War was ultimately not just about destruction. It was about what remains after destruction, about how scars, physical and emotional, are healed, and who, in fact, has the power to heal. And the reflection that Japan would begin to make in the following years could be the key to unlocking the real lesson of war, that technology can destroy, but humanity needs to be rebuilt from the recognition of the suffering of others. However, for this to happen, both the winners and the vanquished would need to face their own truths. But to what extent would reflection be allowed? And more importantly, what would happen when history began to reveal not only the winners, but the human cost of their victories? When the smoke finally cleared over Tokyo, revealing a city reduced to its skeleton of ashes, the strategic lesson became impossible to ignore. There, in that silent dawn, there was not only the collapse of the Japanese capital, but the definitive confirmation that the entire military structure of the Axis, from Japanese imperial doctrine to the German belief in its technical invincibility, was already collapsing under the weight of a simpler and more devastating truth. Modern warfare belongs to those who control industry, logistics, and time. Just as Berlin had discovered too late that tanks without fuel and bombed-out factories do not win battles, Tokyo was waking up to a reality as harsh as it was undeniable. The enemy it faced was not an army, but a civilization driven by mass production, scientific calculation, and total mobilization. The thesis is closed. American industrial power not only won the war, he redefined the very meaning of victory. And in this clash emerges the universal lesson that crosses borders and decades. In war, courage can sustain a people, tactics can save a battalion, but it is logistics that determine the outcome. Strategy is born from the ability to produce, transport, and replace. Tonight's story shows that ideas, no matter how noble or ferocious, do not resist when confronted by a war machine that manages to put in the air, in a few hours, more aircraft than the enemy can imagine defending. As one German general confessed after the war, summing up the Axis defeat with a century-long frankness, "We were defeated by trucks." The phrase, dry and bitter, could well echo over the rubble of Tokyo, because there, among the embers, it was clear that mathematics was mightier than the sword. If you value research, history, and the courage to revisit facts that still burn in the human consciousness, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This strengthens our work and keeps alive the search for historical truth. Comment below which most shocking fact of this journey marked you: the number of bombs dropped, the scale of the destruction, or the calculated coldness that guided each step of the operation. And activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to dissect here. Because, as much as this story closes, another one begins in the sequence, and each of them reveals a new fragment of how humanity struggles, falls, rebuilds, and sometimes forgets. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.